Thank you to Peter, Fabio, and Ishwar for having me today. So I'm Tom Pollard. I'm a research scientist at MIT in the Laboratory for Computational Physiology. And I'm also responsible for a data sharing platform called PhysioNet that we'll be talking about today. So I think the pandemic was a wake-up call for many of us around data sharing. Researchers around the world turned their focus to building predictive models to beat COVID. This report by the UK Turing Institute then concluded that of the hundreds of AI tools that have been built to catch COVID, none of them had helped. And actually, many they thought had caused harm. And when they looked at what had gone wrong, they said that many of the problems were down to poor quality of data that researchers used. And they use this term Frankenstein data sets that I like. They talked about people not being able to find the data they needed to do their work. So they pull these data sets from across the web, splicing different data sets and often containing duplicates. And as a result, researchers were making lots of mistakes. In one case, or in many cases, they found algorithms were being trained and tested on the same data, which is clearly problematic. They found that some algorithms were using the text font of hospitals to make their predictions. So some of the hospitals had high COVID caseloads, some had low COVID caseloads. And so the algorithms were just looking at this font, recognizing the hospital, and then making a prediction based on the hospital. And again, if you're trying to build models that are using patient physiology to make the predictions, that's not what you want. They found that people had used somehow this data set of children X-rays had been incorporated, and these children didn't have COVID, and some of the algorithms were just learning to identify children, and then we're saying, well, it's a child, it's a child and it doesn't have COVID. Again, it's not using, it's not doing what you want it to do. There were patients who were lying down, patients who were sitting up or standing up in these chest X-rays, and the patients who were lying down were usually much sicker. And so there was one group had developed an algorithm to predict severity of illness or COVID risk. And it was using the patient position, it was recognizing a patient was lying down and then saying, well, this patient probably has a high risk. And so again, it's not using the physiology that you want. I think, many of you may have followed along the Surgisphere story, which was very interesting. This was early in the pandemic. There was, on paper, very credible CEO of a company, a vascular surgeon, Sapan Desai, MD, PhD from University of Chicago. He announced that he had this data set of over 100,000 patients across several hundred hospitals early on in the pandemic, and that this had high COVID incidence. And this data set was used to do pretty serious research that was published in New England Journal, that was published in The Lancet. This is their website in, I think, May 2020, announcing that they've just, read our article featured in The Lancet. Huge global impact. Clinical trials were actually stopped because of the, the results of these studies. And then people started to question where the data set, where the data had come from, how they managed to get all these COVID patients from across the world, from across, all the continents. And then everything started falling down. The papers were retracted. It turned out it's still unclear whether or not the data really existed, whether it was made up, what was behind these papers, but the papers were retracted. It was a huge waste of time, but I think much worse, it really helped to cause kind of mass confusion and distrust in science. And I think that was, for me, one of the worst outcomes of, or the biggest kind of insights of the pandemic was the fact that miscommunication is kind of one of our major issues. And I think that this kind of scandal contributed to it. If you're interested in the gory details, then you can read this article in The Scientist, and where they kind of look at what went wrong with the Surgisphere scandal, and they say that this calls for a review of how science is conducted, published, and acted upon. So I know that we all know this. We need formal open channels for sharing data, but I think we've known this for a decade. We've known this for many years. And still, we're caught by surprise when the pandemic came along that we don't have good channels for sharing data, and people aren't sharing data in the way we want them to. It's difficult to share data, particularly when it's sensitive data. But if we don't actively share, then we're inhibiting research, and worse than that, we're just pushing data onto less safe channels. So, okay, I'm here to talk about PhysioNet. So PhysioNet is a data publishing platform at MIT. It was established in 1999 as an outreach component for a research project. So the NIH had funded a research project to develop bedside algorithms for predicting outcomes of patients. And as an outreach component of that, there was a website, and then it turned out that some people were interested in the data that was collected as part of this project. And so, the lab put some of the data on the website, and then that grew into PhysioNet. I joined the lab in 2015, and shortly after, completely rebuilt the PhysioNet platform with the goal of following FAIR principles, good kind of software development principles, and giving data sets an equal prominence to the articles that they underpin. So what kind of content do we publish? Well, it all started with the MIT BIH arrhythmia database. This was collected in the 70s. I think the lab was very forward thinking around data sharing. And so they collected these ECGs, they annotated them, and then they distributed them on 9-track tapes. And the data set became very widely used in the world of arrhythmia detection, and actually ended up becoming part of the federal guidelines in the US. If you were developing an arrhythmia detector, then you needed to produce kind of benchmark stats on this MIT BIH data set. And then this was shared on the PhysioNet website. And then from this, the lab started to share more data sets. And one of those is MIMIC. So this was kind of created in the early 2000s, and it's been continued since then. It's a highly detailed critical care database. MIMIC 4 is the current iteration. We have over 40,000 patients in there with ECGs, vital signs, medications, free text notes, chest x-rays, all of the data that's collected on patients as they go through the intensive care. And this is now extensively used across education, research, and industry. Actually, so extensively used that this was at the start of this year, Stanford researchers looked into language models around healthcare. So, this is like the ChatGPT models that are being developed specifically for healthcare. They surveyed the literature, found 80 machine learning models that had been published on. And, the idea was that we've been making lots of progress in these language models, but when they kind of digged a bit deeper, they found that almost all of those models were trained, entirely trained on MIMIC, because MIMIC is one of the only public data sets available to researchers of its type. So that was nice for us that MIMIC was being so widely used, but also kind of highly problematic, because we know that when you have homogeneous data, you have data from mainly white patients from a wealthy Boston hospital, then that's not going to generalize well to people across the US and actually people around the world. So we can't make algorithms fair with oversampling or sophisticated modeling. If you want your models to work on patients around the world, you need to have kind of diverse data representing people from around the world. So we've been trying to focus on getting kind of data from around the world. One example is BRAX, a Brazilian data set of chest x-rays, 40,000 x-ray images, de-identified, and so we do a lot of work on de-identification in the lab, and then annotated by radiologists. Another example is VitalDB, which is a vital signs database collected from patients at Seoul National Hospital, and it's one of the largest public data sets of its kind. So why do people publish on PhysioNet? So we have over 25 years of chronological experience in safely sharing clinical data. And that means we can help with data preparation. We have tools for doing things like de-identification. A lot of the data we need to work out how to deal with dates and names and other patient identifiers. So we have tools for removing these identifiers from data. We want everything to be fully open, but we recognize that a lot of the data that we're sharing can't be fully open. So we have access control. We have ways of restricting data to a set of users. So for example, we can require users to do a data use agreement. For data sets like MIMIC that I talked about, we do a formal identity check. People submit profile information and we review it. We ask people to do training in human research. And again, we review the certificates. And then if we're happy, we will give access to those data sets. We collect schema.org metadata and we distribute that to indexing services like Google Datasets. We work with MIT libraries to assign DataCite DOIs to datasets, and it means we can start doing citation tracking. So this is in Google Datasets. If you search, you'll find datasets on PhysioNet, and you'll find information about provenance. You'll find things like authorship and licensing information, those things. We're developing visualization tools. So, not everyone wants to download the data. We have clinicians who are just interested in browsing ECGs. We have tools to visualize waveforms on the platform. And that's a popular way to kind of browse data. We integrate with the cloud, currently Google Cloud and soon Amazon Web Services. So we put data onto the cloud, and then people can analyze the data in the cloud without having to download it, which is becoming increasingly important because of the size of the data sets. So on the right here, you see a Python notebook in someone's browser, and they're developing a neural network to classify chest X-ray images, all done in the cloud, working with the PhysioNet data in the cloud. Obviously, FAIR is a big thing, and so we do our best to follow FAIR principles. And we're a recommended journal by a recommended data sharing platform by various journals. So we increasingly try and work with journals so that when a paper is published, the data that underpins that paper can go into PhysioNet, and we coordinate the publications of the data and the papers. So what's the impact? We're not very good at measuring this, to be honest. We're a very small team, and we end up doing a lot of the work we're doing is kind of firefighting rather than actually proactively going out and collecting things like metrics. But I can say in 2022, we had around 20,000 new users create accounts, and we think those are genuine users. We filter spam accounts and things. Around 8,000 of those users did the full credentialing process that I talked about, where people are supplying profile information, a reference, maybe a supervisor or a colleague, details on training that they've completed, and we manually review those applications. We use things like ORCID profiles and ORCID trust markers to help kind of review people's profiles. We published lots of data. We had lots of citations. So in Google Scholar, I think we counted around 6,000 citations in 2022 to PhysioNet content. Lots of university courses are using PhysioNet data. I think the numbers for me are kind of just numbers, and it's difficult to know what that means. But what I did was just look at a conference that I might attend. So Machine Learning for Healthcare 2022. This is a popular conference at the intersection of medicine and clinical research, and looked at the accepted papers. There were 68 accepted papers. And then of those, 28 of those made use of PhysioNet data. So, I think my experience is when I go to a conference, there will be, if it's an intensive care clinical conference or if it's a machine learning for health conference, there will be a significant number of studies that are using data that's made available on PhysioNet. Something that we've had great success with and that we enjoy is running workshops and challenges and datathons around PhysioNet content. So we will travel around organizing events where we bring together clinicians, data scientists, statisticians, and then we all work together on focused research questions over 2 or 3 days. This photo is from the 49th annual conference of the Society of Critical Care Medicine in 2020, where, again, we worked on these clinical research questions. And that was so successful that they now have made these datathons an annual event. So what's next? All of the code that we use to build PhysioNet, we've made completely openly accessible. I find this very exciting. We're starting to see people kind of reusing our code base. We're kind of working on a couple of pilot projects with the University of Toronto and University of Ambarara in Uganda to create kind of PhysioNet clones. So our goal is to create these data sharing platforms and then try and start linking them together. The benefit for us is that we now have multiple people working together on the same code base. And as University of Toronto, this is the Health Data Nexus platform that is data, sharing data for researchers and clinicians in Toronto. As we work with these guys to develop their platform, we're also benefiting from the development work that they do on our code base. We are a partner in the NIH Bridge to AI program. which is developing national infrastructures for data sharing for AI research. We're trying to improve support for common data models. There are lots of efforts towards creating common data models like OMOP and FIRE and so on. And so what we're doing is working with these communities to try and make PhysioNet a good place for sharing OMOP data sets or FIRE data sets. And then we're trying to integrate tools that sit on top of those data models. And lastly, I just want to highlight this effort that we're involved in. This is Standing Together. You can read about it, datadiversity.org. And this is developing standards for data diversity, inclusion, and generalizability. So, we want to make sure that diversity is properly described in the data sets we share, and that people are sharing diverse data sets. And this is an effort to work towards that. So, yeah, thank you for listening. And that's my final slide.
That's great. Thank you very much, Tom. I have one quick question first. So I noticed your model of building separate instances of the same software. So presumably you're of the opinion that getting people to agree on shared software is easier than getting people to use a single shared platform in your field, at least.
Yeah, I think partly it's our, I think we are very limited by, we're a research team. I'm a researcher, but I'm still doing a large portion of software development. And we just can't deal with all the different types of data. People come to us with data sets they want to share, maybe proteomic data or genomic data, and we say we're not the right place for this. Or environmental data, and what we want to do is make sure there are places that people can share. We just don't think we have the expertise to deal with, these different data sets. We'd much rather communities build their own platforms. Yeah.
And then your problem becomes a problem of integration.
Yeah, that's it. And we're trying to work out what that integration means. I think, we want to share discovery. So if someone comes to us and searches, they don't find what they want, but they may find it on the Toronto platform. We're sharing information about users. If someone is a trusted user on the Toronto platform, then maybe that means they're a trusted user for us. So that's the idea.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. And Francis.
Just a quick question. I'm definitely not very familiar with this platform, but presumably, there's health data. Does it get updated with outcomes?
It's a good question. I guess with outcomes, I think of, so we support versioning. So something like Mimic is a data set that's been around for over a decade now. And so we will release new versions. So I guess from that perspective, outcomes are being added. I think one of the things we're thinking about now is maybe it's not outcomes, maybe it's slightly different, but the machine learning community really want good quality labels. So what we do is, encourage the community to develop labels for data sets we share, maybe COVID or not COVID, and maybe that's not explicitly coded into the clinical data, but there are ways of deriving, a label. And so we encourage the community.
Long COVID.
Yeah, that kind of thing. Yeah. So, so we do encourage continued, release of labels or outcomes. Yeah.